Right, so does it for us here now on the news at this time. Let's quickly move on to our first discussion. Now, Nigeria's rising public debt profile has continued to be the subject of national discourse in recent times as the country's total debt stock now stands at 41.60 trillion naira as of March 2022. It's an aberration that while external borrowing has been on the increase since 2015, the living conditions and key macroeconomic fundamentals in the country have continued to deteriorate, causing a drop in government's revenue drive. As government keeps arguing that the borrowing remains under its self-imposed threshold of 40% to gross domestic product, with debt to GDP currently standing at 23.27%. It is, however, difficult to justify the unfettered accumulation of debts in the face of the dire revenue constraints and lack of evidence of the effective use of such borrowings to boost the Nigerian economy. Well, let's dissect these developments and other burning economic issues. As I'm now being joined live virtually by the partner and head of deals adversary at the PricewaterhouseCoopers PwC, Mr. Kunle Amide. Thank you so much, Mr. Amide, for agreeing to speak with us here on Business Nigeria at this time. So there are two schools of thought. There are two sides of the divide. One is comfortable with our borrowings, and the other side is, of course, not comfortable with just how much we are borrowing, our debt profile. I wonder, with your analysis, which position you belong to.
Thank you very much for having me. You know, the point is it's not bad to borrow. But what's the problem we have in Nigeria now is that, like you rightly pointed out, the debt levels compared to GDP is not high, significantly high compared to similar economies globally. The challenge we have is that our revenues, they are significantly low and they've been depressed for quite some time. And there's very little headroom for the government. I think it was in April this year when we had the publication that we spent over 100% of our revenues on debt service. So that makes it extremely unsustainable. And as a country, there needs to be we need to pay significant attention to this. My viewpoint is that we really can't afford to continue to borrow. And if you look at the plan, even the 41 billion trillion that you mentioned now, to fund the rest of the 2022 budget, there's plan to borrow, I think, an additional 6 trillion or thereabout. And even in the next FY 2023 budget that has just been published, the deficit there is almost 11 trillion, which the government still plans to borrow to fund. So those are quite they are big numbers, and it's not our revenue outlook does not justify such debt levels. So we really need to rethink the strategy and focus on very important things that will help optimize our revenue profile.
Mm. So I wonder if your position perhaps is also whether this action is in breach of all reasonable known debt sustainability thresholds.
Yes. It's almost we cannot afford to spend 100%. No, that cannot, even as an individual, you can't spend 100% of your income on such. So I think the priority for us as a nation, and I think if you look at it, the revenue, we still rely heavily on crude oil proceeds. That has been, we've been dealing with issues relating to vandalization, crude oil theft, and the likes. Our OPEC quota is currently about 1.8 million barrels per day. We've been trending around 1.4 million barrels per day. And that gap shows that at least about 400,000 barrels is there available for us. And with oil prices at the levels they are currently at, easily, I think we did the analysis at the office a few days ago, and Nigeria would easily earn an additional 5.8 trillion naira if we are able to deliver this additional 400,000 barrels of crude at that price point. So what that basically does for us is, if we have that done, we basically don't need the extra borrowing in 2022, for example. We will not need, we maybe less than half of the 11 trillion planned next year will be required in borrowings. So all of those that's a very quick win. And I think we've seen the pipeline surveillance contract that has just been announced. But my own view is that a lot more needs to be done. We need to be laser focused on these oil theft issue and how we will be able to recover the 400,000 barrels of crude. It's not because oil price has been at these very high levels. The whole world, all the oil producing economies have really benefited except Nigeria. And with our current fiscal position, I'm not sure we can afford not to take advantage of this.
Well, let me also ask you, I mean, perhaps we'll discuss issues around the capacity to manage Nigeria's debt profile in just a moment. But there's also the argument as to whether or not issues around subsidy, which you have mentioned, gobs a lot of money. I mean, for instance, in 2023, going by the budget, we are to spend about 7.5 trillion naira on fuel subsidy for 1 year. However, Mrs. Zainab Ahmed, the Minister of Finance, Budget and National Planning, says if we put an end to fuel subsidies payments in mid-June, middle of next year, perhaps Nigeria would only spend about 3.3 trillion naira roughly. So where do you stand? Do you think we should put an end to fuel subsidy by the end of next year or mid-June?
I think it should have been done yesterday. Because if you really look at it, with the amount of money we're spending on subsidy, it's we passed the government key component there is that prices in the market will be determined by forces of demand and supply. And not getting rid of subsidy has really even impacted our ability to fully implement PIA. And that's an act that is meant to drive investments into the oil and gas sector and make sure the production that we really need, we get them back on stream. And beyond not being able to do that, we now still, we can't be borrowing to fund subsidy. It's really not something we should be doing. And borrowing to fund subsidy, and if you even think about it, the average Nigerian basically may not be benefiting significantly from this, the impact of this subsidy. But that's another argument. The real one is just for us to understand that if we have to borrow, we need to use such funding to support projects that will enhance our ability to generate more revenues in future. We shouldn't borrow to fund consumption, not when we now talk about subsidy.
So let me ask you, Mr. Kunle, if we continue to borrow, if our debt profile continues to rise, walk us through what you would consider as the long-term effects of this to Nigeria's economic growth.
I think the headroom that we have is not looking good. And I'm not sure the timeline before we get into a near catastrophic situation is not too far ahead. Because if we are already spending 22%, 23% of our GDP, that's just budget alone. But in the 2023, that's just the revenue. In the 2023 budget, about 11 trillion out of 19 is going to be borrowed. And as you know, given what's going on globally, interest rates everywhere is going up. The yield on our Eurobond is currently at about 13% or thereabout. So the pricing of even the refinancing of our existing debt becomes a lot more expensive. And those high yields shows that investors are already uncomfortable with the fiscal position of the country. So for us, what it means is that the more we borrow, the larger the share of debt service and related expenses in our budget. And that means that we have less amounts available for critical infrastructure spend and even to support the government. So ultimately, where we will most likely get to is a situation where there's very little or no money for us to invest in critical infrastructure. Imagine ASU has been on strike for a while. Negotiations are ongoing. It's quite difficult for the government to raise the financing, the cash required to meet their demands. There are so many other pressing issues in healthcare, roads, and so many aspects of the economy that cannot be funded just because the funds that should be used for them have either been allocated to debt service or subsidy or related maybe public sector non-recurrent expenditure, which really are more consumption than anything that will support our future revenue potential.
And does this in any way perhaps put a question mark on the capacity of the current administration perhaps to handle these issues, but with close reference, of course, to issues around Nigeria's rising debt profile?
I think it's just more around...
Especially when you consider the current policies in place by the Central Bank of Nigeria, for instance.
Yeah, I think it's more around them being able to prioritize the quick wins that can get us to a point where we will be able to bridge the gap. For example, I mentioned the crude oil theft issue and the potential addition of about 5 to 6 trillion naira at current oil price levels. So focusing on those types of initiatives that would deliver very quick returns should be top priority for the administration. I think we are less than a year into the end of the administration, but what will be very important is that with initiatives and policies that helps increase the revenue profile or even lay the foundation for a sustainable more tax collection framework will make it easier for the next administration to succeed. But that's my own view of what needs to be done, because there's a lot of challenges in the country, and this particular one is a ticking time bomb that we just need to prioritize and ensure that we deal with. The current approach of just developing a budget and planning to borrow to bridge any shortfall is not sustainable.
And then perhaps, Mr. Kunle, in terms of revenue generation, just how critical is that for us, and how urgent is the need for a tax reforms in the country at this time?
It's extremely urgent. We've spoken a lot about the crude oil proceeds, but tax is a major source of revenue for governments globally. Unfortunately, I think Nigeria, our tax to GDP is extremely low. I think there was a publication by PwC a while back that says that is about 6% or thereabout, one of the lowest globally. And that you can link to the informal nature of our economy. I think the informal sector accounts for about 60% or 65% of the economy. What that implies is that, yes, government needs to collect more taxes, but The question is, have we invested enough in the infrastructure that will make it possible or easy for government to achieve that? Because it is easier to tax those in the formal sector, but you can't continue to tax the same set of people over and over again. And that really then doesn't support investment. So the priorities for government should be to increase the tax base, bring more people into the tax net, but that significantly requires active engagement and processes that will bring those in the informal sector to the formal sector, and with a framework that will allow the government to tax them effectively.
Mm. All right, Mr. Kunle, I would like to perhaps read something for you, because some have likened this path of ours to that of Sri Lanka. And so some experts and analysts say that this particular path is by the government is to ensure that the Nigerian government implements globalist policies in exchange for debt relief. And of course, they believe that these policies will in turn destroy Nigeria's economy instead of fixing it. I wonder what your thoughts are about this kind of analysis.
Yes, I agree that we need some restructuring.
I mean, because I may have to also remind you that Mr. Vice President, Professor Yemi Osinbajo, is in the US, and one of the things he has called for is for Nigeria and the continent is the fact that there is a need for our debts to be to be written off.
Yeah, but before that, debtors we agree to such proposal, at least they need to see that the country is moving in the right direction. Any gains from such reliefs, it is expected that that should translate into something positive for the citizens. So we also need to improve on the fiscal discipline that we have, and what these loans that we raised, what were they used for in the first place? How were the contracts that backed those projects awarded, and how easy it is for investors to be comfortable that they were fairly done. So when we project to the world that that's the case, then we can build a case, but there still needs to be something more fundamental in how we organize ourselves locally, because we've seen Sri Lanka and how it ended, but I think we still have a chance to correct certain elements of the country, just to make sure we don't end up like Sri Lanka. But I think there's still room for us to achieve that.
And walk us through your recommendations and what you would perhaps describe as the ways forward, really, Mr. Kunle, especially as we delve into the second quarter of the year, or the final quarter of the year 2022. What are your projections?
It's really tough, because normally when we get into election seasons like this, it's quite a lot of things becomes extremely unpredictable. But for us as a nation, what we need to do is very clear.
All right, Mr. Kunle. All right, I think we lost connection with Mr. Kunle Amide, partner and head of deals adversary at the PricewaterhouseCoopers, PwC. Of course, we have been looking at Nigeria's rising and disturbing debt profile, and the fact that in the 2023 budget, according to reports, we may exceed our limit. And we're discussing all of this amidst issues surrounding fuel subsidy in the country, which, according to the Minister of Finance, Zainab Ahmed, it is set to go 7.5 trillion naira in 2023. But if we put an end to fuel subsidies by middle of next year, it should help reduce the cost to about 3.3 trillion naira. Well, we'll see how we can get Mr. Kunle back Mr. Kunle, are you back with us?
Apologies.
All right. So, well, you were saying that you're not very optimistic and positive about your projections, and that's because you said there's an election just around the corner.
Yes, and it's that's what we've seen in the past, and our view is that we just need to be cautious and tread just approach the second half of the year pragmatically, because the priorities for the country should be around how revenue can be enhanced, how our debts. I think the vice president is having the right conversations. We need to have some sort of restructuring of our debts, and either to some total relief, tenor elongation, coupon reduction, or a mix of all of this. It's critical because the impact on our current earnings is just too much. And ultimately, the budget itself we need to look at it again, and be sure that the expense heads that we have in there, they are absolutely necessary given the dire situation of the economy at this time.
All right. Well, that's a good place to leave it. Of course, the issues around rising debt stock is one that we must continue to pay attention to as we also get to increase on our tax processes and see how we can carry out reforms in the tax sector. But thank you so much for your insight, Mr. Kunle Amide, partner and head of deals advisory at the PricewaterhouseCoopers, PwC. Thank you indeed for your fascinating insights.
Thank you very much.